Hubbard was in fact making it up. It was all made up. And perhaps realizing that at the very end, there was a period in 1988 when he died in 86, they finally released the top level of the Scientology bridge, which would make you at cause over mental and physical matter, energy, space, and time. You'd be able to blow planets up. This is what was promised in the early 1970s by Hubbard. And finally it's released after he dies. So he's pretty safe now. And for the first week, the introductory document to that course said, it was a Hubbard statement saying that he was the Antichrist and Lucifer. So he had come to destroy Christianity and take the world over. That was his intention. That introductory statement was removed from the course after a week.
All right, we are back again with Jon Atack. How are you doing today, Jon?
I'm very well indeed. How are you, Eric?
I'm doing well myself. There's been a bit of sad news in the Scientology community, of which I don't consider myself part. I've spoken to different ex-Scientologists, and the first ex-Scientologist I guess I spoke with was Doug Scott Kramer, and he has recently passed away. He was found deceased in his apartment, and it's very sad. He was 50 years old, which is way too young in my opinion, and I feel like he's a really generous soul, a great guy, and actually had introduced me to another individual I've had on multiple times, H.G. Tudor. But Doug is just a really generous, fun soul, but very troubled. And with your reputation, I hate to say specialty, but reputation, specialty, what have you, you've helped a lot of people leave Scientology, and I'm guessing other cults and things of that sort.
Yeah.
And I kind of wanted to discuss that, about what happens when people leave a cult, because I've observed an odd pattern of behavior. And I'm not saying that Doug had this behavior. I just know that Doug has suffered, from all those in there. He's only been out for 17 years, but I guess he made it to like level 3, something or another.
He was
so
pretty high. OT3, yes. Yeah.
Okay. And I think that's pretty high up there, right? It's
3 steps above clear, and the whole business goes up to OT8. So yeah, okay. He was meant to have superpowers by this time. I did OT5 and still don't have any superpowers, much as I worked at, other than an inexhaustible fund of information about Ron Hubbard, which I could live without, frankly. But once it's in there, yeah. He was somebody who presented really well. He was very articulate. He was obviously very smart. But it is a problem that there are 2 things here. The first is escaping from Scientology. And I, back in the past was involved with probably hundreds of people leaving quite directly. But the second part is, how do you now integrate the experience? Leah Remini, in her excellent book, Troublemaker, said you can take the girl out of Scientology, but you can't take Scientology out of the girl. Now, I wrote to her as soon as I read that, which was before Aftermath, and said, do you want a hand? And she didn't. So, and that's the first thing to get past, that we come out of Scientology believing ourselves superior and elite and all-knowing and godly, that arrogance is difficult to displace. It's quite usual in other groups as well, but Conway and Siegelman in their book Snapping said that where, with Krishnas or Munis, 3 to 6 months after you leave, you'll have accommodated the experience. With Scientology, they estimated, and they interviewed, I think, 33 Scientologists, they said. With Scientology, they said it takes 12 and a half years unaided to recover. And little bit. They published in 1990, and somewhere in 2013, I made a mistake in a statement I'd made at Tony Ortega's Underground Bunker, and Tony, bless him, published it and contacted Conway and Siegelman and corrected me. So I was sent to the corner with the dunce's cap on. And I got in touch with them and said, when you said 12 and a half years, you're estimating, would it not be more true to say that unaided, most people never recover from Scientology? And they came back and said, yes, that's what we think now. And getting somebody to do that, I mean, that's why I wrote Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky as the beginning of a deconditioning process so that people could realize that Hubbard was a confidence trickster, a pathological liar, and all sorts of other in terms of invective we might use. He was also deeply involved in Crowleyite magic, of course, and I don't think that ever stopped. I think that was always in the back of his mind. That was not something he was going to share with
and Jack Parsons, sex magic. They had quite the triad of winners, shall we say?
Absolutely. Yeah, having tried basically to end society, to end humanity, they performed a ceremony in January 46, Parsons and Hubbard, to incarnate the Antichrist. That's where they were headed, and bring about the 1,000 years of misrule before the second coming of Christ. It was very much his intention. It's interesting that Charles Manson had the same intention, having studied Scientology for 14 months. While he was in prison. But he came to a similar conclusion.
Well, he's a receptive audience. I mean, Charles Manson, his background, his mother, I mean, the abuse, whatever. I think that his view of life was probably perfectly tailored to see that. And he might not have needed deep study to say, oh, yeah, I get it. But I wanted to talk about identity a little bit. And I wonder if this isn't a major issue. That someone, for example, I've ran a few marathons. I'm completely out of shape right now, but I have run them. And while I was doing it, I was like, I'm a runner. Now, I personally think now that that's a mistake. And I should say, I like to run, but not that I am a runner. And with Scientology, correct me if I'm wrong, you are, or people are wrapped up in, I am a Scientologist. And that is now part of their identity. But then when they leave it, and this is the problem that I have, and I don't know if it's NLP aspects or whatever, but our mind tends to not pick up the negative. Like we just hear the positive affirmation in a sentence. So please don't spill that milk. Your mind just hears spilling the milk. It has to visualize spilling of the milk before it can just say not to do it, versus the positive affirmation, which is carry the milk across the room steadily and set it down. Now, if you say, I am not a Scientologist, or I am anti or ex-Scientology, the big word that sticks out is Scientology. And it goes right back, I think, to the Leah Remini thing you said of you can't take the Scientology out of the person. And where I'm going with this is, it seems to me like some people are leaving cults only to become cultish.
Yes.
In a different way.
Yeah, I mean, the first stage of that is cult hopping. I was amazed when I met various people in California when I was over in the 80s. One of them had a master's degree from Yale, and he went from Scientology into Santeria, which is Brazilian voodoo. I've got nothing against Santeria and voodoo. I think they're as good religiously as probably most other things, but I'm not that keen on sacrificing chickens. It's just that way. I never eat at KFC. So that was a really weird idea that you could go from Scientology to this. And I saw that so often. There was a huge following for channelers like Dr. Peebles and Ramtha. A lot of Scientologists bounce into that. So that's the first thing, cult hopping. In fact, the craziest example I know was a friend of mine who decided that color therapy would be the way to go. And all you had to do was eat food that was the right color and you would be spiritually, fine. And a friend of mine said to us, so have you discovered food dye yet? That you can just color your food and you'll be perfectly spiritually attuned. So that seeking, that desperate need for something to fill some sort of hole is there. And with some people, they'll go to a conventional religion. With others, they'll go into a therapy system. And often they'll carry the same kind of fervor that they had for Scientology. And they'll now be trying to get you to take vitamin D in massive doses, or whatever it is that they've got into that is the way, the truth, and the life. So that part of it's fairly evident. You see cult hopping, you see somebody moving from one belief system to another. But the other, underneath that, is what's been implanted by Scientology. Now, Hubbard talks, Hubbard said that what's wrong with us is that millions, trillions of years ago, we were implanted with certain ideas which we're not aware of. He, of course, said that Christ was an implant. He also said that Scientology was completely compatible with Christianity, which is not, in fact, true. So you have these implants. Scientology is a system of implanting you with ideas. And where a group like Transcendental Meditation has just two techniques and has caused a lot of harm, that's my opinion from having talked to former members, there are just two techniques. Scientology has 2,000. It also has the largest literature, probably, of anything outside Hinduism, which is a massive literature. Hubbard
and
is
all
listed
written by
as
Hubbard, who was a maniac. Sorry.
Yes, and replete with contradiction. That in his original book, Dianetics, The Mental Science of Modern Health, he says it on one page, hypnotism was not used in any way in the development of Dianetics. Further on in the book, he says Dianetics came out of a study of hypnotism. Now, that is typical Hubbard, that he is lying and contradicting as he goes. And somehow we didn't notice it. I read that book 3 times and didn't notice that it is packed with contradictions. And all sorts of bizarre things about how most women want to abort their children, So what happens is that you come away...
I'm sorry. I want to go back to the contradictions because I actually think that's a methodology.
Yeah, Hubbard himself said that if you give people conflicting information and you're the authority source, they won't know what to do and they'll come to you to get their orders. And in Scientology, even simple things like there's a policy that says if anybody asks for their money back, you give them their money back. And there's another policy that says if anybody asks for their money back, you don't give them their money back, which is what got Hubbard into trouble in Australia. There was one man that he wouldn't give $3,000 back to, and the whole Australian inquiry came about because of this one individual being annoyed with Hubbard. But yes, you've spotted a central point of the whole business, which is that you take relatively intelligent people and give them conflicting information, and somehow it locks you in the way you think. You then, of course, the fundamental method of hypnotism is confusion. If you can confuse somebody, then you can drop a little suggestion in while they're dazed, while they're not quite able to register. And Scientologists are astonishingly confused. And you come away from that, I've had this thing where I talk about the cultic shell if I'm trying to talk with therapists, because most psychotherapists, when faced with a former Scientologist, they'll mess them up. They don't know what to do, and they'll get their cookie cutter, their template, and try and impose that. What happened in your childhood? This, that, or the other, behave this way, do this, do that, without first of all realizing that if you've been conditioned in Scientology, you will interpret the world through the lens of Scientology. And you have to get that layer away before you can get further in. Sad to say, I mean, I had a guy, he'd been 20 years pretty much in solitary confinement. He'd been housebound for 20 years because Hubbard had told him he was a suppressive person and he didn't want to hurt anybody. So he stayed home for 20 years. It took one afternoon to deal with that. And I was furious. It was one of those moments where it's like, this man's life's been taken away from him because of Ron Hubbard, because of something.
How did you deal with it?
Well, by taking him through, in this case, the particular concept, which is the idea of the suppressive person, and getting him to reassess himself. He actually did read Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky over the 2 days before. His wife had persuaded him that he should come to England despite everything and, go back to the place where it had happened to him. And they visited a lovely woman called Jo Scott, who'd been Hubbard's secretary in 1954 in London. And she said, "Oh, you should read this book." He read the book and it called me up, came over, and he'd understood that, Hubbard was not a trustworthy source of information. But and often people leave and go, "Well, look, I spent hundreds or even thousands of hours receiving Scientology processing," as Hubbard called it, auditing. Therefore, I'll have to undo it with hundreds or thousands of hours. It's not at all true. The case that I use, and she's been quite public about what happened to her, so I'm not violating any confidence. It was a young woman who had grown up in Scientology. She was sexually abused from the age of 6 or 7 by her stepfather, who was a Scientologist. Scientology did nothing about that. When she was 11, she complained to the police because a friend of hers, mum, realized something was going on. And a woman called Jan Eastgate, who ran Scientology's Citizens Commission on Human Rights, persuaded her to withdraw her police report. She went back into the household. The stepfather then beat her for 5 years. And at 16, to escape, she joined the Sea Organization. And she had 5 years of horror in the Sea Organization. She left. She got a medical degree. She was on a master's program. And Steve Kinane, the journalist who wrote the wonderful Fair Game about Scientology in Australia, came and begged me to talk with her. And this was back in 2013. And I really don't do that anymore. And he told me the circumstances. And I went, "Oh, so, she left when she was 21. I'll be talking to a young woman." When we first spoke, she was 37 years old and highly intelligent, very articulate, a really lovely person. But she said to me, I think it was our first conversation, is it true, as Hubbard says, that reality is an agreement? And this is the idea that we are all of us conspiring together to make the universe, the world as we see it, appear. Hubbard put it that we're all chanting space particle position all the time. I can't say I've ever found myself doing that. But so she asked me this question, and it's a fundamental idea in Scientology, the idea of reality being an agreement between us, rather than it being out there and us being relating to it.
Sounds very postmodern, by the way.
Doesn't it? Yeah, absolutely. One of the horrors of contemporary society, the idea that literary criticism has now expanded out into every area of science, and that your opinion about the theory of relativity is as valuable as Einstein's. It's a silly nonsense. But so she asked me the question, is reality really an agreement? And my response was, well, yes, if you're the hypnotist, then and have got everybody agreeing with you, then yeah, they will see. But otherwise, no. The next week when we spoke, she was triumphant. She was jubilant. She said, "I've used scented laundry conditioner, fabric conditioner." And we both knew what she was saying. We hadn't talked about her time in the Sea Organization, that she will have done what's called the hygiene hat, a training in hygiene, which says that you're not allowed to use any scented products because scents are being used by the psychiatrists to control us all. So Hubbard had scent phobia, as did Rajneesh, quite interestingly. They both had an ultra sensitivity to scent. And so she'd basically taken that first thing, which was, oh, if reality isn't an agreement, and she'd started thinking. And that's how you break through the cultic shell, when you come into control of the ideas and you're able to challenge Hubbard's ideas and look at them piecemeal, bit by bit, and say, is that true? And if you find that it's still useful to you and you believe it's true, then fine, keep on believing it. But of course, there are a lot of little seeds that Hubbard plants that then grow into concepts that make you view the world in a different way. For example, the idea that you are a fallen god, which is the essential idea of Scientology, that you have magical powers of intention, which is something, The Secret was a new incarnation of this idea. Christian Science has it, Theosophy has it. It's all over the place.
Well, that's Napoleon Hill. Actually, it precedes. That actually precedes Scientology.
Napoleon Hill's on the route, but you've got Norman Vincent Peale, you've got Robert Pellman in the 30s, you've got Ralph Waldo. Ralph Waldo Trine is the earliest I know of in the 1870s. But the idea that my intention controls the world, which is another way of saying I have magical powers. So Scientology is a 20th century form of magic. And you come away believing that you are causing the events around you by having bad thoughts or wrong thoughts or this sort of thing. You don't realize.
Which, by the way, hold on. Before I go too far on that, part of the reason I think this is effective is some of it I think is true, only in the sense of internalization. Now, when I say internalization, and I think that's more into psychology, I can't tell you, John, how to live your life or what to think or what to even think about me. But I can act in a manner toward you because I could change myself and how I interact with the world and then get a better feedback from the world. So that's not magic. That's effort. That's thought. That's constructive, in my opinion. And I think that some of these groups take a principle like internalization and then they push it to these other levels. And correct me if I'm wrong, some of the lessons in Scientology, like I talked to somebody from the Sea Org, it's like there's some actually good tips in there, and then they just keep going until they're psychotic.
Well,
is that a fair analogy?
Yes. You can change the way you think, feel, and behave in the world. That is, to some degree, under your control. So you're born with a certain temperament, and out of that you develop a character. So you can change. And psychological, like the Dunedin study in New Zealand, has really shown that people change immensely during the course of a lifetime. This is 1,000 kids born in 72, 73, I think, who've been followed through their lives. And they've found that their personalities change, contrary to what Carl Jung and the Myers-Briggs personality test say. We change tremendously. That's up to us, how we think about the world, how we feel about the world, how we interact with it. But making people's heads explode at a distance of 100 yards or blowing up a planet or, not so much. And the idea that everything that happens to you is caused by your thought, that is a really dangerous idea because it means people blame themselves for things that are just consequences of being alive. There is a whole conception, this would include the idea of karma vipaka, action and reaction, which originally was about prayer rituals being properly done and you get a bad result if they weren't. And it expanded out in Hinduism to this idea that you deserve everything that happens to you. So when Arthur Koestler, in a book called The Lotus and the Robot, he was very bothered that his friend Aldous Huxley and various other people he knew were falling into the belief in Japanese Zen Buddhism and Hinduism. So he visited India and Japan. And one of his comments about India, which he reckoned came directly out of karma, and I can see this, is there were no charitable organizations other than the Christian organizations in India, because the thought was, well, it's your own fault this thing happened to you. So helping somebody and doing something, once you've got a conception of that type in your head, you stop having compassion. You stop sympathizing with other people's difficulties.
If you go too far. Because, again, that's one of those where I feel like there's, again, a balance there because, I agree. Not everything that happens, if somebody runs the red light and they hit your car, I mean, how could you be in control of that whatsoever?
Exactly.
But that doesn't mean you have no ownership in your life. You have no control in your life. So I feel like the tricky part is the balance to say, okay, did I contribute in any way to whatever has happened to me versus it's all my fault or it's never my fault. And I think about the whole thing of, and I'm sure you've met these people, I have too, where they go, they can't seem to hold a job. And every time you talk to them, it's that workplace, they don't do anything right. Those sons of bitches, or I had this manager, they're rude. And it's like, there was a comedian who said, it's like, there are plenty of assholes in the world, but if everybody you run into is an asshole, well, then you're the asshole.
Yeah.
And so that's where I feel like, and I never want to throw the baby out the bathwater, that there is kind of a balance in there that we do have some control, not full control, obviously, like I use the example of that car accident. Sure. But then now if you're speeding and somebody pulls out a little bit, well, they may not have realized that you were going as fast as you were going, but they shouldn't have pulled out. So now there's a little bit of responsibility going to both of you, correct?
Yes. I mean, there's in psychology, you'll meet situationism. Philip Zimbardo is one of the champions of this idea that we have no choice, that situations compel us to do certain things. And I would say that, there is truth in situationism, that as you say, somebody goes through a red light, what are you going to do about it? But I would agree with you absolutely that we can do something. We should accept that responsibility that is our own. But if it's raining, saying, "Oh, well, I caused that, I made that happen," it puts you into an absurd position. And with Scientologists, you leave with this notion that you're a super being and that you are hindering yourself, which is the fundamental notion underneath Scientology, that you are a god with absolute powers. Really the thought is that you can blow up planets and do this kind of thing. So if you get a cold, that's because you did something wrong. Well,
Right.
yeah, you breathed in a virus. That's what you did wrong. It's not because of some self-punishment, some karmic retribution that you're pulling down upon yourself. So getting past those ideas, but as I say, the fundamental thing is being able to challenge Hubbard's ideas. I've often encouraged people, and never successfully. It's now 40 years since I left Scientology and started doing this, and I've never managed to get ex-members to sit down in a small group, probably less than 12 people, and talk about the principles of Scientology. I did this once, and many years ago, and I had indeed 11 other people in the room, and I said, "What we're going to do, if between us, we had somewhere over 200 years experience of Scientologists, the people in that room of Scientology, and I said, let's take the principle of the 8 dynamics, which is the idea that we survive along 8 different vectors or routes. So the first is you survive for yourself. That's the first dynamic. The second is your family and sex. They're included together. The third is
all of and any of the.
Well, the hierarchy of needs and various other things. In fact, this idea was first bruited in about 1900. And I've seen a book that it was printed in, but sadly, when I went back to the guy to ask what the book was, he'd lost it. But I saw it. The first 4 dynamics that Hubbard put forward were something that he encountered. So the third one is all your groups. The fourth one is survival as mankind. You then go through the physical matter of the universe, the spiritual situation of the universe, the other living creatures, and God. You've got these 8 dynamics. And what Hubbard says is that you should make your decisions so that the larger number of dynamics are satisfied. So I sort of went, look, I'm going to start to my left. I want to go all the way around the room. And if you could just give me an example of a time when you used the 8 dynamics to solve a problem. It was fascinating. More than 200 years in Scientology between us. Nobody had ever tried to use it. And it's said to be a fundamental principle. And then the deconstruction of it is, so I get one vote, mankind gets one vote, God gets one vote. There's a kind of an imbalance here. If you believe in God, then surely only God has a vote in you're not going to do something that's good for the other seven dynamics, but God would disapprove of. So that goes. But the idea that you get a vote that's as important as the other 8 billion people in the world, it's a nonsense. But it's put forward as if it was a scientific principle. And you keep going. So, for example, Hubbard tells us that affinity, reality, and communication, if you increase any one of them, the others will increase. So if you communicate more with somebody, they will like you more. They'll have more affinity for you. But he also said
That's
bullets
true.
too are communication. And it's also, in my experience, true that if you yell at somebody, they usually don't like you more. And at that point, this whole thing, and these are foundational principles for Scientology, it all falls apart. But until somebody has actually looked at it for themselves, and this is why I actually encourage people to discuss this with others, to bring it out, maybe sit in a book club and read one of Hubbard's books, like Fundamentals of Thought or Problems of Work. They're a good start. And principle by principle, look at it. When I left, there was a group of people who called themselves the OT committee, people who'd done OT3 and above in Scientology, and they had these meetings. And there's a woman who'd been in this committee, and she said, we discussed the Scientology axioms upon which all of Scientology is based. And we spent something like 2 years trying to get through them. And in the end, we realized they don't make any sense. So, for example, one of them is space is a viewpoint of dimension. And Hubbard boasted he was the first person to define space outside terms of matter and energy. And space is a viewpoint of dimension. I sat with a woman who was fervent about Scientology. She was an independent Scientologist. And I said, here's an example of something that's just nonsense. It's just tautology. It doesn't tell you anything. And she said, oh, no, I'll explain it to you. 2 hours later, she said, it's a nonsense. It's a tautology. Space is a viewpoint of dimension. It's like you haven't learned anything. And so much of Scientology. So I think once you feel you can criticize, once you feel you can disagree, and a large part of Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, which was the book out of which Russell Miller's excellent Barefaced Messiah, his biography of Hubbard, he had my manuscript, he marked it up. I was his researcher, I was his only researcher. But his concern was to write a biography. My concern was to show that Hubbard contradicted almost everything he said about himself. So even his idea that he'd been a member of a blood brother of the Blackfoot Pekuni people is not. He said that he was 2 in one place when he became a full-blood brave, 2 years old. This is quite something. One place he says he was 2, another he says he was 4, another says he was 6. When you get to his first novel, Buckskin Brigades, in the 1930s, he says that he found out about these people by meeting somebody who'd actually lived with them. So this story about him meeting somebody, his aunt, Margaret Roberts, when she was interviewed by Russell Miller, and until he was 12 years old, he was in the same household as her, said that she knew nothing about the Blackfoot. There are no Blackfoot there. I eventually traced it down that the train journey he was taken on when he was 6 months old from Kalispell to Helena passed through a Blackfoot reservation. And I think there was probably some family story from his mum about them, them probably begging on the railway station. They were in pretty bad shape, those poor people, by then. We're talking 1911. And that story in his mind expanded out, as did every other story. He was not an explorer. He didn't study with gurus in India, China, Tibet, or Mongolia, all claimed by him. He was not a nuclear physicist. He was put on probation and thrown out of college on a civil engineering degree. But but he was most certainly not a combat veteran. He was not. He didn't see combat at all. But he made all of these fanciful claims, and the problem was that as I researched 22 of their published biographies, no two of them agree. He says different things in all of them, and yet he's a fabulist. He's making these things up. So that's helpful to understand that he was a liar, to understand that the man who said, honesty is sanity, the road to truth must be trod with true steps, was a pathological liar. And that can begin a process where somebody can, that kind of hero worship, that thing we do, you join a group and you go, what would the best version of me be? What do I regard as the best qualities? And you project them into the leader. You say, oh, this person is perfect. So for me, when I found, Hubbard had a furious temper, which he exhibited on an almost daily basis, that for me was a very important moment, because I think anger is a terrible thing, and that we should be able to deal with people without bullying them and pushing them around. So that changed my mind about him. But I came to a point where I said, because I left Scientology because I believed. I didn't leave because I'd stopped believing. I left because of the brutal new regime. As David Miscavige at the time said, they were tough and ruthless. I could deal with tough. That was fine. Ruthless, not having any mercy, that's not acceptable to me. I think we should be ruthful. I think we should be merciful in our dealings. And that pushed me away. And I was about half of the membership left between 82 and 84. And I really wanted to, bring Scientology to the world. I was a true believer. And then I got all of this material about Hubbard.
Now, how long did it take? I'm curious. When you broke away and essentially were doing a spinoff, how long did it take for the entire narrative to fall apart? Like, once you got out of it, because from what you're saying, it's almost like a purity test. Like, you got away because the leadership was too corrupt and against the ideas of Scientology, to which you completely subscribed. How long in actuality was it when you got away from it, you go, oh, wait a minute, these ideas themselves may be the problem?
There are stages, as Janice Gillum Grady, who worked with Hubbard on a daily basis for 11 years, pretty much, from the age of 12. She said her show is called Undoing the Layers of the Onion, or something like this. And that was something that became very apparent very early on to me. So I left. I resigned formally, I think, on the 18th of October, 1983. And I was then at the center of the independent movement in the UK. Basically looking after, defending them from the attacks of Scientology, which were fairly ferocious, and trying to keep harmony between the groups, because the independent groups started fighting with each other almost immediately. And by, I think it was late November, I was given a package of documents collected by a journalist called Michael Lynn Shannon, which had come from an attorney called Michael Flynn, who had, I think, 25 cases against Scientology. And these documents proved irrevocably that Hubbard had lied about his background. So his college records were there, documents about his supposed expeditions, all sorts of things. And that meant that my attitude, so firstly, I'd lost the organization. I'd said, no, this organization is harmful. It's damaging. It's hurting the people within it. It cannot be the vessel for Scientology, for this good and wonderful thing. And then it was Hubbard. It was kind of going, oh, well, he was a liar. I had my last auditing session in January 1984. And that because I was on OT5, and these levels, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 are all about you being composed of thousands, millions of little beings, which Hubbard called body thetans. And you're meant to be getting rid of these things, and you're meant to somehow, so it's demon exorcism fundamentally, but on a mass scale. And I went into those last sessions, and the first day I sort of said, I don't think I actually have ever had any body thetans. And the auditor blanched. This is this independent Scientology. And the next day I went in and said, I think that there's some kind of, mental machine, or maybe some stuck attention units, which was an old Scientology idea that had been abandoned. But no, nothing I've dealt with has been another being, has been another spirit, soul, self, or ego. And the auditor blanched. And the last day I went in, I said, I've just made it all up. There was nothing there at all. This is so. Then I said, in the 9 years I've been in Scientology, I've never had the specialist rundown that deals with people that are connected with suppressive persons. Almost everybody I knew had one of these. So maybe there's something wrong there. And so I was given a session to detect who the suppressives were in my life. And I hadn't thought about it, Eric. I really honestly hadn't thought about it until she asked me the question, which is basically, who's suppressing you? And I said, L. Ron Hubbard. And she went white. I'd never seen that happen before. The blood drained from her face because, of course, she was a believer, a fervent believer, bless her. And that was it for me. I didn't want any more auditing. I've never, in the 40 years since, wanted to pick up the cans again and do any of it. It stopped having value for me. And I suppose the final break was probably May of 84, so 7-8 months after I'd left, when I shared an OT3 pack with somebody. The great taboo, if you see this material, you'll be dead within 2 days. And this friend of mine came along, and he'd done OT2 in the so-called Church of Scientology. And he said, I've got £500, I can buy OT3, Advanced Ability 3, as it was being called in the independents, or I can buy a Ducati motorbike.
Go for the bike.
So I said, well, I think you should buy, I think you should go buy the bike, but here's an OT3 pack. You can read it. You can decide if you want to do it. And he came back to me, and it was a very weird experience because that weekend, this would have been the June of 84, in fact, thinking about it. That weekend, I'd met Jerry Armstrong for the first time, who was the man who'd collected the huge archive of Hubbard material while in Scientology, realized that it conflicted entirely with Hubbard's public statements, and that he'd been chased and harassed. There was even an attempt to kill him by driving him off the road to stop him from revealing this material. And he'd said to me that when Hubbard was researching operating Thetan level 3 in 1966, he'd been taking a lot of drugs. And among these drugs was phenobarbital, the barbiturate. And so the next day, my friend returned the OT3 pack, and he said, Hubbard was taking barbiturates when he did this. And I went, hang on a minute. Not just drugs, but the exact drug that Jerry had named the day before. And I said to him, how do you know this? He said, well, when I was a teenager, I joined the Merchant Marine so I could travel the world and take every drug known to man. So he'd had a real career. And he said, if you take too much of a barbiturate, then you start to fragment. You start to feel that you're a multiple being composed of many little selves. And so this is what Hubbard was doing. Years later, in 1986, I interviewed a woman called Virginia Downsborough, who rescued Hubbard from Gran Canaria and the Canary Islands while he was screwing himself up by doing this thing. So he wrote the materials while he was there. She said when she arrived, he wasn't eating, he wasn't drinking, he was living off and my hands are going to have to go wider than the screen, a shelf full of drugs. And I was never able to get to tell me what those drugs were.
Mr. Anti-Drug himself.
Mr. Anti-Drug himself. The perverse thing was that the friend I had with me started saying something about OT3, and Virginia said, shh, I've got people doing the course in the next room. So even though she'd seen the state Hubbard was in, and even though she'd seen that he was a multiple drug user, she nonetheless, these years later, 20 years later, she was still believing that this was a workable and useful thing to do to people, to tell them that they were clusters of little beings all imploded together 75 million years ago by the Prince Xenu by being dropped into volcanoes in Hawaii and the Canary Islands, which of course didn't exist 75 million years ago. If we want to get pedantic about it, they both erupted about 9 million years ago. But so that, getting the evidence, understanding that Hubbard was in fact making it up. It was all made up. And perhaps realizing that at the very end, there was a period in 1988 when he died in 86, they finally released the top level of the Scientology bridge, which would make you at cause over mental and physical matter, energy, space, and time. You'd be able to blow planets up. This is what was promised in the early 1970s by Hubbard. And finally it's released after he dies. So he's pretty safe now. And for the first week, the introductory document to that course said, it was a Hubbard statement saying that he was the Antichrist and Lucifer. So he had come to destroy Christianity and take the world over. That was his intention. That introductory statement was removed from the course after a week because many of these, so these are the top level, these are the highest level graduates of Scientology. They've done OT7 and here they are being given, Truth Revealed, the course is called. And the truth was that Hubbard believed himself to be the Antichrist, the devil. And a few people left because of that, despite being devoted to Scientology, and this material leaked out.
A lot of people in the world would agree that he was the devil.
Yes.
I'm just saying.
He was a devil, yeah.
That wouldn't be too far. So to wrap things up, because we got tight on time, would it be fair to say that the first step to escaping this is to get a recognition of cognitive dissonance? And it only has to be one thing. Like, instead of trying to go after the entire religion, just go after one concept, just one single concept. As you mentioned earlier, where you spent 2 hours going over the view.
Space is a viewpoint of dimension. Yeah,
exactly. Is that an appropriate way to do this? And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Daryl Davis, but what he has done with people who have really poor views, they can't stand black people, they're racist, Ku Klux Klan, actual Nazi types, whatever. He himself as a person is the breakthrough of the cognitive dissonance because he's a very personable guy. And these people who have determined that they hate all these groups like Daryl. And the first step to recovery is saying, oh, I hate all these people, except Daryl's okay. And as soon as that happens, it starts to unravel the whole thing. Now, is that a similar principle only with like a piece of information or knowledge of like, why are you doing that specifically? And
it'll be the organization, it'll be Hubbard, it'll be that, the heavy ethics policies where people are brutally punished still in Scientology for things they've done, the sleep deprivation, the malnutrition, the bullying, recognizing that anything within those aspects, but also I do think it's important to understand the history of Scientology. So while there are more than 100 autobiographies by ex-members now, and they're very valuable. But as yet, there's only one history of Scientology, and I wrote it. And I wish somebody would update it so that I don't have to do this anymore. But
you can.
I think it's vital to. Well, yeah, if I wanted to spend the rest of my life doing this, which I absolutely don't. It's 40 years now, Eric. 40 years.
Get a co-author.
But it goes up to 1990. So it's. I think it's important to understand that Jesse Prince, who was the top man in the technology, the auditing Scientology in the early 1980s, he said that it took him 6 years before he could pluck up the courage to open the cover of Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky. He was so phobic about it. And then he said he read it 3 times. And he recommended that everybody read it 3 times because it's kind of information rich, 420 pages. But I think reading that, getting, understanding that you've been scammed, whichever way you go, that this man is a con artist. But then, yes, absolutely challenging the principles. And if it still makes sense to you, don't reject it. Also, if you had benefit from your membership of the group, and people do, that's fine. It's not you don't want to be, a pendulum sort of swing. It was all good, now it's all evil. You want to be rational about it and say, these things are workable. These things are useful for me. Now, my point of view was 40 years ago, I said I reject it all because how can I look at it unless I reject it all? I must be outside of it to look at it. And I will accept back piecemeal those bits of it that make sense to me. And 40 years later, none of it, absolutely none of it has come back, because wherever there was a principle that seemed vaguely right, Hubbard himself says you should trace ideas to their origin. And I published a paper called Possible Origins of Dianetic Scientology. He never came up with an idea. Everything comes from somewhere else. And he distorts it because he believed that for something to persist, it has to contain a lie. So any principle he picked up that comes close to being useful, he will have changed in some way. So there's nothing within it that I find useful. And but that's me. If somebody still wants to believe that, some principle within this, then that's fine. But it's making sure now that it's what you've worked out. It's what your experience tells you, rather than being what Robert J. Lifton calls ideology over experience or doctrine over person. An example of that would be that in Scientology, Hubbard says that anybody who is a psychotherapist, a psychologist, or a psychiatrist, they're all called the psychs, is part of a grand conspiracy to destroy all life. All these people are evil. Now, as a teenager, I had a friend who was a psychiatrist, and she was not evil. She was a good person. So I never took that on. Ideology over experience would be where if I'd said, oh, yes, she really was evil, she really was a bad person, and you start skewing reality. So when you leave, it's realizing that you can decide what's relevant to you. And as I say, a discussion group, there's a book group called the CARES group. We're just putting up a video with them. And they're members of different groups. They're all over the world. And they meet to discuss books. But they're essentially looking at books that will help them change and recover. So I think also the book Take Back Your Life by Madeline Tobias and Jan Jelelic, I think that's a very important book. Steve Hassan's Combating Cult Mind Control. It shows you that you weren't part of an exclusive elite. All cults believe they're an exclusive elite. And, with ex-members, they often don't want to accept that it was a cult. When we were Scientologists, we knew that the Moonies were a cult, but we weren't. And when people leave, they tend to cloister themselves. They'll only hang out with people from their own group. Good idea to meet people from other groups and realize that the same mechanisms are applied, because human psychology is the same. So we respond to the same things, and the same tricks will be there. I would also, and terrible plug, but my book Opening Our Minds, which is looking back on the whole thing and assessing the whole authoritarian cultic reality, and that's available as an audio book too.
Right, and that's my next question. Hold on. Blue Sky is an important seminal work, but it's not an audio. Why? Just
because of the sheer effort it takes to record an audio book. So my shorter book, Scientology, the Cult of Greed, which is very useful, hopefully for people who've never encountered Scientology. It's got and it goes through the nastiest parts, and it gives the documents that support that. So, for example, in 1947, Hubbard wrote a letter asking for psychiatric treatment to the Veterans Administration. So that's printed in in the short book, Scientology, Cult of Greed. There is an audiobook of that. I'm hoping this year, the book on Charles Manson is taking up all of my time at the moment. There's just so much material. It's like, there are 140 volumes in the first trial. So getting my head around that. But I am hoping probably in about 6 months' time to do an audio book of Blue Sky.
And if you don't, there are options that I can share with you too. If you wanted another narrator, as an example, that's
if I could afford one, yeah.
Well, no, you split. ACX.com. Narrators will take a split, or you can pay them outright. Often that's a good way to go because they put in, God knows how many hours. 420, that's a lot of hours. So it is a piece of work. So that's another option. But we'll talk about that offline. I'm just thinking it would be really cool, especially somebody like me who I don't have time. I either listen or I don't really get to them because I have too many other things going.
Well, it's an interesting thing, really, because an audio book will take you about 3 times as long as reading from text. Listening to something takes a lot longer.
I can be walking. I can be exercising. I can be doing yard work. I can be doing chores, things in my life I have to do. And rather than being punished, they're punishments, they're now my pleasure. So to get out and walk and exercise, I am multitasking by having an audiobook. When I have to drive somewhere, I am multitasking. So that is why. It's literally how I'm fitting it in, because the time to just sit and read, well, I'm busy constructing. I'm busy researching something for an interview, or I'm busy doing some sort of posting and things of that sort.
Yeah, I mean, I would also caution that if you are seriously seeking to study something, you're better with the text because while you're multitasking, your attention will be
I'm going to push back on that
from what you're doing.
I'll push back on that again. I actually retain the information better when listening, and that was something that shocked me.
Okay.
Because it's the same way as people who write down something as they're hearing it. The dual action of the writing it down and the listening actually enhances it or duplicates the message. I will walk into a store and then remember a part of a book that I was listening to at that exact point in the store when I was walking around. So I don't know if you've ever heard of Memory Palace.
Yes, of course. Yes, many, many years ago.
I think that audiobooks with me are kind of a memory palace. Now, there are times I will get distracted, but then I rewind. Because if I'm distracted, I lose my place, so I have to go back to actually listen. And what I have found is that when I was reading, I would read 100 pages an hour or better, but I tend to start skimming. I tend to start, getting more faster and faster and faster. Whereas with the audiobook, I have to hear every word. I can't just skip words. Okay. I got to hear them all. So again, this is my personal thing. Other people, it could be the complete opposite, obviously. But I get it.
I find, to read something, every book I read, even if I'm reading a novel, which I don't get much chance to do, I will annotate. And, that will, currently on the Manson books, any book will have about 200 notes. And I would find, using an audio book, so it is very much a matter of how we acquire information. Some people are audio, some people are visual. Sure. My memory is largely word-based. So the printed word for me is a more effective way. But in this case, you can't listen to the audiobook because there isn't one. Exactly. So we urge people to rush out and buy a copy of Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky. And probably Barefaced Messiah, Take Back Your Life, Combating Cult Mind Control. And the point to get over with Scientology, I call it the only one implant. Hubbard talked about this and said, people believe that they're the only one that understands. And it leads to this condition where you don't need to know anything more. There's psychological work that says if you tell a child, wow, you're brilliant, you're fantastic, you're amazing, they will get stuck. They won't progress. Whereas if you say, this specific project you did was really well done and the work you put in.
That's it, right? I think it's right there. Grit. There's a book called Grit, Duckworth. And with kids, they're not the smartest, they're the best. They're the hardest worker. I admire your effort. I admire what you work so hard on that. And that is encouraging, again, the process versus the result. And being too far ahead can actually be a curse. The most successful people and kids are the ones who have a slight aptitude and maybe are a little ahead of their peers, but not much. And so they still have to work just as hard. They do get a benefit slightly more quickly, but that's just enough to reinforce the effort versus, this is so easy. And then they start to get lazy.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. And most child prodigies fail later in life. Possibly. I mean, I feel really lucky that at school I was considered to be average. And but then when I changed schools when I was about 15, and suddenly there was this thing about me being really smart. And I don't think that did me any good at all. And I certainly messed up. I left school at 17 without completing the courses. But I am driven by my curiosity. I am not driven by, the idea I'll make a lot of, certainly haven't made any money, so that's not driven me. But when I left Scientology, I wanted to understand what had happened, and I wanted beyond that to help people. So, I don't really do recovery work anymore, but I've worked with about 600 people on their recovery. I had an email the other week, which was astonishing. A woman said that she'd spoken with me for 1 hour on the phone in 1994, and it completely transformed her life. And it's just because I'm a catalyst. I'm somebody who's listening, and I'm somebody who may be able to provide a piece of information that fills something in. But I'm very grateful to say this isn't the only time this has happened. And the thought of somebody, 30 years later, saying, that was a turning point for me. So sometimes it is just that, an hour talking with somebody, and they've got it sorted. They've got the information they need to carry on. Sometimes, I have one guy that I was talking with off and on for 35 years before he turned around and went, actually, this stuff is rubbish, because he'd clung on to a part of it because of a trauma bond, in fact. He'd actually been raped by a school teacher who'd then given him a Dianetics session to run out the incident, would you believe? So sometimes it takes a long time to get through, but it depends on a lot of it on the willingness of the person. If you come to it saying, I don't understand, I don't know, there's more I should know, I wonder what this information is, rather than I already know it, so I won't bother finding out. And people, as I say, 20 years housebound, you can just be stuck in this set of ideas. And they're very destructive ideas, fundamentally, because they erode compassion. Scientology is a path to narcissism. It's a path to, not caring about anybody but yourself, which is very much, where Hubbard himself lived. So you're sort of cloning yourself on this essentially very ill man. He was physically and psychologically, psychiatrically ill, and he knew it. And, so in public, he'd project this wonderful friendliness, which is typical of cult leaders. But in private, when you talk to people, I've talked to people from 1950 onwards who worked with him, and he'd have these morose fits. He'd become depressed and lock himself up for days, not talking to people. He'd have drinking bouts. Of course, there was multiple drug abuse at various times. He was not a happy man. As with any narcissist, and narcissism was only a tiny part of what was wrong with him, he needed the adulation of people. So when in 1965, he puts forward this idea of the world's first real clear, John McMaster. When I interviewed McMaster 20 years later, he said that Hubbard was so jealous of him. He was furious that McMaster was adulated and he wasn't. And you get this idea of he was in 1968, he was interviewed by a journalist, and before, there's a wonderful film called The Shrinking World of L. Ron Hubbard that Charlie Nairn made. And Charlie said that he asked him, he put it to him that it was a scam. And Hubbard assented to that idea. He's ridiculous. I don't know what state he was in, but he said, yeah. And so Charlie, who's an exceptionally bright man, said, So it must be really difficult for you keeping that to yourself, you know? And Hubbard said, yeah, poor me, you know, I have to scam all of these. And so Charlie said, what makes you do it? And he said, well, the first thing is it's really lovely at the end of every day to go to my wife and say, we made $10,000 today. This is 1968. This is like, 100,000, whatever, into their bank accounts. But what I really like is to catch the clever ones and reel them in. And you suddenly realize you're dealing with somebody who didn't get past the age of 10 emotionally. He's immature. He wants to get his own back on the clever kids, and he did, and created absolute chaos as a consequence.
Well, hopefully
it's not just Scientology; it's the 200 sub-cults that came out of it as well.
Sure. Well,
like
hopefully,
Nixium, for example, or Est.
True. Well, hopefully, with more chats like this, we will see fewer people get snagged into it. If not escape, at least prevent others from falling into the trap. And Jon, thank you so much.
Yeah, well, and
definitely have to
great
chat
pleasure
again.
as ever, Eric.